Welcome back to our study of Jakob Mipham Rinpoche's Jakob Leschly, the Sword of Wisdom. And as always, kindly recognizing the value of this in terms of how suffering exists in individuals, in subjectivities everywhere at all times. Recognizing the relevance of what we're doing now in terms of getting to the bottom of what drives suffering universally. So that's what we call preparing with bodhicitta. So we kindly generate this at the beginning of our study. Can someone just please confirm that the sound is okay? Good, thank you. All right. So us not relying on our own wisdom, then invoking the masters of the lineage in general, particularly Jakob Mipham Rinpoche. So then really from the depth of our heart then, through the blessing of awareness emptiness, Manjushri Kumara, you open the expanse of wisdom and its 8 minds of confidence, thus mastering the great treasuries of transmission and realization. Mipham Manjushri Gosha, I supplicate you. So we have presently in our study, we've looked at the topic of this entire work are the 2 truths. And we approach the 2 truths in terms of understanding that there are things that appear to us as they do, and this we don't deny. And in the Buddhist teaching, kindly, we don't begin with talking about heaven or something that's sort of higher and alternative and something that we could just sort of think, that's nice, I can get away from it all. But rather we begin with relating with the reality that we experience, conventional truth. But the point is we want to go beyond the way that we actually misinterpret and misunderstand, and you could say essentially approach our reality in a delusional way, both in terms of our own person and also in terms of all the perceptions that we have. So the object of the Buddhist path is enlightenment, and the object of the Buddhist path is to understand how things actually are beyond the way that we in our confusion project onto it. So that's what we're penetrating. But we would say the nature of reality as such is what we call absolute truth, and the situation that we experience right now from which we need to begin. Like Pema Chodron says, start where you are. That's what we call relative truth. So in the Buddhist teaching, we begin with where we are, relative truth. But we do so with the intention and using relative truth as a means to actually arrive at insight into the nature of reality. And we're doing this on the basis of sound science. We're doing this on the basis of not just believing in something or feeling that it's our tradition, our culture, or because there's people that we like that have done it, or because we like the teachers and so forth. We do this on the basis of actually investigating the validity of the teaching. We investigate the validity of the teacher. We understand what it is that we're undertaking, and we engage with this, again, on the basis of observing phenomena and using reasoning. Again, coming back to the Buddha who said, never accept my teaching out of respect or faith, but on the basis of your own investigation. Just like a merchant would only purchase gold once he or she has validated its authenticity. So that's where we're approaching this in terms of using reasoning. And that's a big topic in the Buddhist tradition, and it's particularly relevant for us in the modern world, where so often the understanding of what lies beyond appearances, the scope of that which is beyond our ordinary science, is understood as religion, is understood as something that we sort of go to just to get relief or some sort of like a nice, comforting idea. And that's where the Buddhist teaching doesn't do that. It goes into, it investigates reality on the basis of analysis and actually investigation. And that's a relief for the modern person for whom then this is what we would appreciate as truth. We understand science as truth, we understand religion as ignorance. And that's where it's exactly what we do in the Buddhist teaching, just like we do in science everywhere. We investigate, we look directly at how things function. We look at, and we've specifically looked at 4 kinds of reasoning so far. The way that things function, what are the causes why they function the way they do, and now we're going to be looking at then the way that things stand out as having particular characteristics, what we call the nature of things. But it's in the nature of things that we then begin to see, yes, phenomena, they have a particular quality. Like, for example, the microphone next to me here. I would see it as a very helpful device. I would see the camera as a very helpful device. And as such, I would understand that they have particular qualities. I would, for example, say, well, this camera here I've chosen because there's another kind of camera that I could have gotten, which was cheaper, but not quite as good as this one. And so there's all the time this sort of process of validating what we're interacting with. And yet, at the same time that phenomena have this nature, also there is, and they are essentially, all phenomena arise in dependency. They're all put together as, you could say, conditioned phenomena. And in being conditioned, they don't have an enduring unit, you could say, unconditional nature. They are dependently arisen, and hence also they are what we call empty. They're free of any kind of reality that we impute onto them. They are a flux of changing causes and conditions, and hence this camera will not last forever. And even presently, right now, it just exists as a set of conditions put together that I have labeled as existing as then what I call it, a camera. If I was a goat, I might come in here and think and wondering maybe that I could nibble on some of the nice juicy wires or some of the plastic or whatever. So that's where the characteristics, of course, depend on the individual, but they help us to navigate and to engage with the world in a functional way. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, the reasoning of nature. And a good friend of mine is saying, happy Dakini Day, Jakob Leschly. So today is Dakini's day. So the 10th day of the waning moon. Okay, we're going to look at the text. And like I say, I'm going to be going a little bit, you could say, more swiftly, taking some sort of more brave steps through the text, because Khenpo Palden Sherap's commentary really is a gem in terms of going through so many of the details that really are basic to Buddhist epistemology. But I think for the time being, it's just simpler if we stick to the, or rather we don't go into too much of the detail. And I think with my intention with this is that this will catch your interest. I'm afraid that if we go into the details, I might lose the audience. It just might get a little bit too detailed. But at the same time, I would say, hopefully, if this really captures your interest, then you'll be interested to go deeper. And that's where then I would say, please do get the book. Please study this. This is immensely valuable in terms of our own understanding, in terms of us understanding this in relationship to the science that we abide by in our modern context. So the reasoning of nature. So this is then the third reasoning. It's so the Khenpo says the third reasoning, the reasoning of nature has 2 aspects to its explanation. The relative nature, which is appearance, and the ultimate nature, which is emptiness. First, the relative nature will be explained in 2 parts, what it is and its categories. So to explain what the relative nature is, the root text says, every interdependent thing has its own unique defining characteristics like solidity, wetness, or heat. Because that it has its own individual nature, this nature cannot be denied. So again, coming back to any given phenomena, the table is solid. The floor in my bathroom is wet, and the sun rising, there's heat. We can't say, if it's in the middle of the day, we would understand to speak about the weather, we'd more or less all agree, because we'd all be experiencing the same phenomenon basically, and um, its particular characteristics. So we'd say, yeah, it's really hot today. Or if it's raining, we'll say, well, it's raining and wet, and so forth. So that's where we're continually operating within a realm in which we understand how all these phenomena that we experience, they have particular characteristics. Now you might say, well, yes, and well, this is very important for us to begin to navigate our experience in terms of the way that we understand that presently we have a delusional condition in which we're not seeing things straight. So we're listening to the Buddha and saying, what is it you have to say about reality? And the Buddha is saying, yes, things do appear the way you're seeing them. But there's going to be something that lies beyond it. So we need to understand that relatively phenomena exist in this particular way, that they function and appear, but there's something behind it, particularly because it's a dependent arising. There's nothing solid apart from the solidity that we project onto it. So that's where it's very relevant for us to relate to the phenomena around us, to just not just sort of say, well, it's just all there. Yeah, what are you going to do about that? You know, it's that we actually have to humbly say, I have something that I wish to achieve here. I wish to achieve insight into the nature of reality. What is reality? Well, here it is. It's these phenomena with their particular characteristics. Well, we're interested in that. The Khenpo says every phenomenon included in samsara, nirvana, or the path has arisen interdependently owing to causes and conditions and has its own individual nature, not created by something else. So that's where we presently then have a rice plant, which is just sitting there as being a rice plant. It comes about due to causes and conditions, but it's different from the causes. So that's why we say the effect is not the same as the cause. The seed has ceased, and you now have a rice sprout, you have a rice plant. That's basic to everything that we experience. And as such, we can understand the entire, you could say, realm of possibilities for our experience in terms of the condition of confusion, the condition of enlightenment, and also the moment that we're transitioning from confusion into enlightenment. So we could say there's people who are healthy and people who are sick, and then there's people who are recovering. So that's where, for example, when we talk about a particular illness, let's say somebody has tuberculosis, well, that's samsara. There's those who have recovered from tuberculosis, they are nirvana. And then there are those that are presently being treated, they are then the patients, they are the path. So everything in there has its own particular, all the phenomena included in that. You could say the illness, the well-being, and the medicine, and the cure, and so forth. Because of this, a phenomenon is defined on the basis of its own specific characteristics that are not shared with anything else. So that's where the doctor will say, okay, you need this particular medication, and not that medication. Everything has its particular specific characteristics. For instance, earth is solid, water is wet, fire is hot, wind is moving, space is unobstructed, and so on. No one can deny a thing's conventional nature, which is said to be established by the reasoning of the nature. Now, when we read a text like this, very often they use, you could say just like we might talk about the periodic table, or we might talk about things in terms of how things are built or whatever. If, for example, you're a builder, then you might talk about things in terms of the specific ingredients that are basic to the language that you share with other builders. Similarly, also, when you come across a text like this, then sometimes we were just talking about the basic elements, but that's where we actually need to do the homework of taking this out of the context and saying, okay, what does this all mean? Well, this means in terms of my sink. This means in terms of the clothes I'm wearing. This means in terms of the dynamics in the interactions I have with other people. So it's not so we can say, oh, here we talk about, isn't it nice? We talk about earth, water, fire, wind, or whatever. And that's where, yeah, we're doing that because that's how the physical world is constructed on the basis of 5 elements, certainly according to the Indo-Tibetan way of seeing the world, also in Chinese, in the Chinese outlook. But we actually need to do the homework to see this has to do with us. Has to do with our particular world, and look around us and seeing how what we're talking about here is applies to all the aspects of our own experience, everyday experience. And so then the Sutra of Definitive Explanation, and this is, by the way, this is then in 84,000, this is called the Sutra of Unraveling the Intent. So there it says, the reasoning of the nature is like this. The true nature abides, and the basic space of phenomena abides, regardless of whether or not the Tathagatas of the past appeared in this world. This is the reasoning of the nature. And that's you can say, the scope of true science, because that's where we're interested in what a phenomenon is. We're not interested in seeing it on the basis of what some people call it this, some people call it that. We want to just get down to what the phenomenon actually is. And that's where also it comes down to, again, this famous saying that we say the Buddha did not invent Buddhism. What is the scope of the Buddha's enlightenment is nothing Buddhist. The Buddha was just somebody who discovered reality and intended to share this insight with others, because that's where the liberation from suffering lies. So that's how we understand the reasoning of nature. That is how phenomena actually abides in and of themselves without our projections. So that's where relatively then phenomena, they have particular characteristics, attributes, and so on in terms of their functioning. And yes, that has nothing to do with us, so to speak. But also there's, you could say, beyond just the relative compounded nature of how things operate, then there is the absolute aspect, which is that they are not permanent, unitary, solid the way we project them to be. And that's where we go into then, when it comes to the nature of things, we go into the discussion of the two truths. So here we talk about the categories of first the relative truth, the categories of relative nature, functional things and their designations. Functional things and designations means, okay, I need a pen. Well, we all know what a pen is. So if I think to myself, I need a pen, then I look around, where are my pens? Ah, there's my pen. So right there, I'm really just operating with a designation that says pen. It's a universal. If I were to say to somebody else, do you have a pen? They might rummage around and they'd look for something, and they'd then hand me something. And on the basis of me and us sharing these designations, we know what we're talking about when we talk about pen. But then when something comes up, ta-ta, voila, here is the pen. That's different. When we're talking about, I need a pen, or somebody says, do you have a pen? That pen has no function. That's entirely just what we call a universal. It's abstract. It's not actually something. Whereas when I'm holding a pen in my hand and I can do like this and I can start writing it, it functions. So that's where we distinguish between functional things. You know, I need to shop for food. Well, that's true, and that's very helpful, and that's a designation. There is no food in that, but we use it as a designation. So that's also, you know, when people insult us, for example, they say, you fool, you know, well, that actually only exists as an abstract in their head. Whether or not we're going to buy into it, that's entirely up to us. If we can align it with something specific in ourselves, sure. But in general, the way that we talk about things very often exists on abstract levels. So for the two categories of relative nature, functional things and designations, the universals, the root text says, in a single thing, there are a variety of attributes, and there are numerous facts and classifications of terminology that establish or exclude those attributes. Each thing has its own specific nature. So again, like we're looking at here in general, we've established that everything has its own particular characteristics and is classified as, you could say, classifications, office objects, different from carrots, for example. And again, among carrots, there's different varieties. Among office objects and tools, different classifications. But that's where we have language that enable us to understand what and what things aren't. So if I ask for a pen and somebody brings me a carrot, that's obviously not very helpful. So thanks to we sharing a particular language, then we're able to identify what it is that we need and what it is that we don't need. It's a bit more also, it can get also a bit more specific when we talk about this approach, and it's where we begin to understand things in terms of epistemic, or in terms of understanding things not in terms of what they are, but in terms of what they're not. But I'm not going to go into that, but this is something that we sometimes touch on. Anyway, a single thing, like a vase, has various attributes. Some attributes are affirmed and included as what the object is and what feature it has. Okay, we can have a vase which is for flowers. We can have a vase in which we keep perhaps precious objects and so forth. We can bury a vase. We have in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition the notion of a treasure vase, a long life vase, and then of course also flower vases. So there's different purposes, different attributes, different functionings. For example, he says, a vase is impermanent and material for the same object. Other attributes are negated and excluded as what the object is not and what it does not have. So if we, for example, are looking for a particular, if we need a flower vase, then somebody bringing in a bumpa or a long life vase, we say, no, that's not the vase that we need. So we understand these in terms of its particular attributes that qualify it for some things and exclude it for fulfilling other functions. For example, a vase is not permanent and not conscious. That's also something that we know about a vase. You know, of course, you can sit down and have a conversation with your vase, and you can have a very personal relationship with your vase, and you can give it names and all of that. But essentially, we understand with a vase that it has particular characteristics, and others it is lacking. So it's not permanent. It's not conscious. On the basis of conventional terminology, there are numerous facts and classifications. Each thing has its own specific nature that is not created by something else. So it has its own particular function and you could say label as such. An object is thoroughly apprehended by direct perception. Then the conceptual mind, that which distinguishes and combines, uses terminology to label it as a separate thing. Now this is interesting. This is something that happens. We first perceive something, and at that moment we would say there's not particularly a concept, and then the mind clicks in, says vase, says person, says vegetable, or whatever it might be. So that's where we first have then what we call specific things that are then, you could say, objects of our direct perception. Specific things like a substantially existent vase are thoroughly apprehended through direct perception. Now this we're going to be looking at because that's a tool with which we engage objects. This is what happens all the time. Anytime we think of any object that we're related to, we are engaging this with direct perception. This is something that we see. For example, I'd like to have a sip of water. I pick up this and I'm seeing this glass here. That immediately the first perception here, which is a substantially existing glass. It's not a general designated thing. I would say, I'd really like to have some water. That's a sort of a general thought, right? But then the particular specific thing here, that's then something substantially existing. And that I relate to through my subjective way of engaging with that. First is then saying that noticing that there is a specific thing here, or rather perceiving it, initially we would say is free of any concept. Then we begin to label it. My glass here actually could do with a little bit of cleaning and so forth, and it's only that full, and there's little droplets sitting on the side of it here. So that's where we then begin to build stories around it. But the object itself, as you notice, when we first see something, there's a moment where we just see it where the language hasn't kicked in. So then by using terminology, such as being produced, being impermanent, having arisen, and so on, the object's characteristics are designated through terminology. So that's where we first have the actual object, and then we have the concepts of it. He says this is done by the conceptual mind, which grasps a thing by mixing a name with an object. Conceptualization distinguishes and combines things by using terminology. So a lot of us are very politically minded, right? And we like to be politically correct. Well, then we know that if we begin to label foreigners as just the others, and we begin to have all sorts of nicknames for them, and we sort of stick them away or put them into ghettos, or essentially don't associate with them on the basis of ideas that we have, we can see how that plays out on the basis of judgment and on the basis of concepts, and that has very little to do with meeting things. So that's where we in the modern world, we're very aware of how concepts get in the way for us actually directing, relating to any given phenomenon. So conceptualization distinguishes and combines things by using terminology. So this we have on the everyday level, just in terms of what we call tables and chairs and, you know, vegetables and fruits and so on. But it's also something, and that we might say, oh yeah, well, so what? Well, it's also exactly the same thing that happens when we begin to classify people as foreigners and people like this or people like that. So we're not actually we're not directly connecting with phenomena the moment that we're operating from an abstract position of concepts. And what we're aiming at here is talking more actually getting to the nature of the specific things, the actual functioning things. This is not really about anything other than us beginning to be understanding what's happening within our own mind. So of course, you'd say, this is where it's helpful for us to have some understanding, some introspection of what's happening with our own mind. But this is not something abstract. This is something immediate that we can experience and validate right now. So so the root text says objects of knowledge. And with that term, objects of knowledge, that's just Buddhist speak for things that we perceive. It's simply just stuff that we perceive, yeah? Objects of knowledge will be thoroughly understood by categorizing them in two groups: substantial things and designations based on terminology. There are many classifications that elaborate on this. And this is what we've been saying. We have the actual thing, pen, and then the designation. I need a pen. Wonder if somebody has a pen. So the Kempo says here, objects of knowledge are organized into two groups: substantially existence, that are functional things, and designations through terminology. In this way, phenomena are correctly negated or affirmed, accepted or rejected, and engaged in or refrained from. This is how things are thoroughly and unmistakably understood. So this is about us getting down to understand how we actually interact and assert and label the phenomena that we're engaged with all the time. This is very thorough, and you could say this is very rigorous, but I'm sure you can also see this is really important for us to begin to actually navigate our reality and how we are functioning. Then Mipham Rinpoche writes, if one examines the true reality of causes, effect, and the nature of things, one cannot find any production and nothing that arises through dependency. By its own very nature, appearances are essentially emptiness, the basic space of phenomena. Having the three aspects of liberation is the nature of the ultimate. So that's the thing. We've presently looked at, you could say, the functioning of phenomena, the nature of phenomena. We've seen how, let's say, we have a St. John's wort. Well, St. John's wort is has, you could say, curative properties. So it's going to be something that is bound to be good. That's because of its causes. Its effects, we can see that, yeah, it does actually. It relieves this, that, and the other of symptoms that we might have. So we understand how it functions. And we then have something that we call St. John's wort. Well, this is you could say, a curative herb. This is the St. John's wort. We label it St. John's wort. It's just a plant, but we label it in being this way or another. And then we know it. We have little jars with St. John's wort, and we then, on the basis of understanding what it contains and what it can do, we operate successfully with it. Now, if we look at the true reality beyond that, then we would see that even something that we label as a solid thing, St. John's wort or our car or whatever it might be, the government, the nature of a particular piece of music, whatever, all of that exists on the basis of dependency. And so nothing actually has come into reality. There's an appearance, and yet nothing actually achieves a solid, unchanging condition. To put it very simply, otherwise we'd be frozen. We couldn't move. If things were truly produced, everything would be frozen. The fact that we can move, that things change, that a piece of music can begin here and end there, that things grow and turn into something else, this is all because they're never produced. It's on the basis of being empty that things function. So that's where, when we say that on the basis of the things arising through dependency, there's nothing that truly is stuck. So by its own very nature, appearance is essentially emptiness, the basic space of phenomena, how things, let's say, exist without our projections. Having the three aspects of liberation is the nature of the ultimate. So that's where we would say phenomena as they exist, they don't have anything that's a particular characteristic. There's nothing that we actually need to, you could say, achieve, or something that's actually truly existing. And it's also something that doesn't actually possess any ultimate truth about it. So we talk about this in terms of signlessness, wishlessness, and emptiness. So this very often, and also if you come across in the Buddhist teaching, these three doors of liberation, they come about very often in terms of understanding how, or rather, there's a lot of symbolism for that. We very often have the triangle, particularly around when it comes to today's Dakini Day, and we very often see the Dakinis dancing in a triangle, and that triangle, because the Dakini's nature is the nature of emptiness, we would say the Dakini is dancing in that triangle that symbolizes these three doors of liberation. So the Khenpo comments, in relation to what was explained above, the efficacy of causes, the dependency of effects, and phenomena whose nature is cause and effect, one examines and analyzes their true or absolute nature by using the reasoning that investigates ultimate reality. Now, this reasoning that investigates ultimate reality, it's where we go into anything that there is and we question it. Once we begin to question things, we begin to see that their complexity. So the reasoning that investigates ultimate reality is there as soon as we begin to ask questions. And that's where we begin to get a bigger picture. We can just walk into something and just accept it at face value, but if we begin to question, we always begin to see how something is complex. There's many different aspects to the story. And that's where we could say wisdom is when we don't naively just fall for appearance, but we actually understand that phenomena are complex. They don't exist as just good or bad or this or that. So the more that we go into something, the more we see their constructed nature, we finally end up with what we call ultimate reality, that there's nothing actually that we can ultimately grasp. Ultimately, not relatively. Relatively, things function, of course, as they do. But the moment that we investigate, that's when we arrive at ultimate reality. And we would say there's nothing that can withstand this reasoning, the reasoning that investigates ultimate reality. Try it. If you try to see there's this object, we can try and see what is it made up of and what are the items that it's made up of. Or with people, what is the true story of somebody? We should try and take somebody we don't like. You know, we just had elections here. Take the person that you like least of all the politicians, and then begin to look into their life story, and maybe talk with people who know them, and look into how from their own side they are campaigning, and actually begin to see, yes, the picture that we had actually is complex. If we look into something they might have said, we can go into the deeper and deeper details of more and more understanding actually where does this come from, the conditioning that takes place, the people that they came from, their cultural upbringing, what was the, you could say, the conditioning that they were, what were they fed on, all these kind of things. And that's, again, we go down into sort of the aspects of the genealogy and all these sort of aspects. We end up finding that this label that we have on the surface is in fact just a label of what is an infinite, you could say, an infinite web of causes and conditions that can infinitely be further broken down. So that's what we call the reasoning that investigates ultimate reality. And when we apply that, and what he says, if one examines and analyzes any given of the phenomena we've been looking at here, or any given phenomena, when we apply this reasoning, he says, not even the tiniest particle of a nature can be established. The ultimate nature has the three doors of liberation as its defining characteristic. So that's signlessness, which we can here define as the ultimate nature of things does not possess characteristics. Senmameba. Then there's Mempameba, wishlessness. Nothing has in reality come into existence. And emptiness. Nothing exists. Hence, in that there's nothing that has exists, there's nothing that ceases also. So things are not born, they don't abide, they don't cease. Again, when it comes to having any solid reality. The thing is, solid reality is something that we are continually, unless we're very alienated from what's going on in our mind, we should try and notice how we solidify things. So that's what we would call the object of negation here. That's where the illness exists, and that's what we're onto. So he says, although there is causal efficacy and dependency, the reasoning of the nature is the final reasoning. Once the nature of a thing has been reached, there are no further reasons to be sought. So that's normally when we, for example, approach Madhyamika. This is essentially what we're doing. We haven't gone through, in Madhyamika, we wouldn't apply the pramana that we've just looked at, or the valid cognition. We would mainly just look at how things are dependently arisen, and in that they're dependently arisen, we would establish their emptiness. That's good enough. That's all we could do. But what we are doing with the other valid cognitions are understanding how things, however, function within relative truth. So all of that leads to really the objective, which is to see the empty nature of phenomena. But you could say this one here is, you could say, the definitive one. It says, although there is causal efficacy and dependency, and that's what we were looking at before, the reasoning of the nature, actually looking at things, how they just have their characteristics as they do, and yet they are a web of causes and conditions, then we understand their empty nature. So he says, once the nature of a thing has been reached, there are no further reasons to be sought. So that's where once we understand that this, let's say the tiger in a dream, once we realize it's just a dream tiger and it's not really dangerous, then the fact that it's if it's an Indian tiger or what is it, a Bengali tiger or I don't know what tigers there are, a male tiger, a female tiger, a vicious teenage tiger, whatever it might be, all of that really becomes secondary. The circumstances, what tigers could do, because they are, they're strong, they are capable of, eating, gobbling you up, and so forth. So that's where we just understand that it is in fact just a dream tiger, then there are no further reasons to be sought. As explained previously, on the conventional level, there is the causal efficacy that produces effects, and there are specific effects generated in dependence on their own causes. In addition, there is the reasoning of the nature of things, and that's this one here. Because this type of reason states the thing's nature, it is the final reasoning. We arrive at, yeah, there's tiger, yes, but it's a dream tiger. Once one reaches the reasoning of the nature, there is no further reasons to be sought because one has reached the very nature of the thing, like the fact that fire is hot, the tiger is empty. Phenomena appear, yet they have no inherent existence. Okay, see if there's some questions. Are the causes and conditions that we talk about in the rice seedling example themselves dependent on our relative view? I would immediately say no, but anyway, the question goes on. If a rice seedling is not a rice seedling to an ant, then how much can we trust the nature of a rice seedling as a window into the absolute? Just because the rice seedling as an object, so we agree, there's ants' view on rice seedlings and there's human views on rice seedlings, that's for sure. But we are more talking about just the phenomenon itself. Yeah, we're just talking about the fact that something is moving from one state into the next. The tadpole becomes becomes a little frog or whatever. There would be different stages, right? And we're just observing. Whereas for ants, tadpole not so dangerous, but then emerging frog dangerous. We would have different views depending on who we are, but we're merely just looking at the fact that phenomena are in flux depending on their causes and conditions, and as such are empty. Yeah. So any given phenomena actually is spelling out emptiness. And the fact that they function, that even more, the fact that things function, that actually really that's the proof of emptiness. Things couldn't function if they weren't empty. That's something, I hope that jars with you. I hope that everyone's thinking, for things to function, they need to be empty. You sort of go, what? That's really good. Stick with that. This is homework of the week. Things can only function because they're empty. Otherwise, they would be stuck. And that's where we're continually operating, just like if we look up at the night sky. And in fact, the night sky is just spelling out concepts such as time and space have no basis, right? The same way, the fact that phenomena functions is only because they're empty. Is not the reasoning process itself conceptual, dependent, and therefore empty and not so reliable as an indicator of the ultimate? Yes. And that's again where we come back to you could say, the two truths, they only exist in the relative. We have that next line in the next time. But that is true. It's only from our point of view that we who have the deluded subjectivity, we need this. This is the medicine. The phenomenon, you could say the basic space of phenomena itself is free from any such. So that's why, yes. And presently we just operate with what we call a enumerated absolute, as opposed to what we call unenumerated absolute, or we could say presently we are operating with a conceptual idea of emptiness. But you see, that conceptual idea of emptiness makes us a bit wiser. We're not so naive. That's why we understand if somebody hates a piece of music that we love, we understand because that's our particular individual relative truth about something. And so that's where the wisdom that sees this and the confusion that doesn't see it, that all lies within the subject. It doesn't lie in the object itself. The tiger is empty, but can still gobble us up. Yeah, but the thing is, the example here is the dream tiger. So is the aim to accept this gobbling up in equanimity, i.e. be indifferent to whether this happens or not? Is it better to let the tiger eat us than to fight or hurt it? Well, this is all within relative truth. So we're, of course, in relative truth. If there was a tiger, we'd probably climb a tree or whatever, you know. But what we're talking about here is the way that we construct phenomena as having a solidity that they don't possess. And on the basis of that, we then have what then emerges as what we call samsara, which is likes and dislikes. And that develops into the toxicity of the kleshas, where on the basis of likes and dislikes, we then begin to create the narratives, the storylines, and the impulses, and the whole, you could say, aggregation of what we call the 5 skandhas, in which we perpetuate a condition, a cycle of suffering. So we're presently looking at the very cause of our delusion, which is the way that we solidify phenomena in a way that they don't possess. So we give this example of the dream to illustrate that there's something that appears to us, yet it has no reality. But as long as we're stuck in relative truth, we of course need to abide by that. And so if there is a tiger coming, close the door. I had a micro bat in here last night. Was cycling around, and of course, yes, both of us would rather that he or she was outside. So after sort of a whole bunch of sort of maneuvering and keeping the door open, microbat escaped. Well, microbat, minibat, microbat, right? And so, so within relative truth, of course, we need to abide by we need to abide by you know, our relative experience. We shouldn't let the tiger gobble us up. Please don't. Like a friend of mine is a very sweet man. He was what's his name again? Lodra, I think was his name. He was a Nepali, but he was a very dedicated practitioner, and he actually went and practiced chud up in the mountains somewhere in Sulukhumbu. And you know, you go into the cemetery and you just say, gods and demons, whoever there is in the universe who wants a piece of me, come, you know, and there you are with your, you know, your bell and damaru and saibon trumpet and so on. There he was. And at one point, actually, a leopard or whatever it is they have up there, you know, came. And Lodra just says he was absolutely terrified. He was very lucky. It just sniffed him a bit, sort of, and then it sort of turned around and walked away. but in the practice of chud, yeah, you're saying, please come and, you know, gobble me up, you know, to all the gods and demons. And of course, this is all about where we're at. And we're not at the level of, let's say, the Buddha who gave his body to the hungry tigress, right? But we're presently getting at where it is that we solidify self and solidify the object. And that's the path that will take us to that place where then we have absolutely only love. It's like if our kid wakes up in the middle of the night and needs to be fed, well, a parent won't hesitate, won't say, oh, I need to sleep. You know, the parent will be there right away. There's that courage of just wishing, and not even courage, not even thinking of it as courage. Just somebody needs something, I can do that. I want to do that. So similarly, also the Buddha offering himself to the hungry tigress was not because he was sort of like, you know, insane, but because it would have come straight from the heart. If awakened mind no longer produces dualistic interpretations, how does it experience its knowledge that confused minds experience phenomena dualistically? Well, this is actually what we call the 2 wisdoms of the Buddha. One is to know things as they are, being free from dualistic fixation, and the other is knowing how things appear in their variety for individual sentient beings. So you can say that's the compassionate nature, in that there's not the Buddha doesn't just go into some comfort zone of absolute, bliss and non-duality, but the awakened nature is such that there's no longer this smallness, narrowness of self, and there's a complete, you could say, engagement and understanding of what others are going through. So this also we can see this in, you could say, the more relaxed and you could say well we are, the more we naturally are disposed to being there for others. So there's a greater openness that takes place, and that's a rather self-perpetuating cycle in which then also with that also comes deeper wisdom and freedom. Are things empty because they're always changing, never the same? Yes, that's right. So the pen we pick up now is not the same when we pick it up 5 minutes from now. That's actually true. Yes, that's right. Even though we can't see it, there would be, a physicist would probably confirm that it is actually changing, but at a very subtle level, and probably would be a very long time until it disintegrated. But yes, and we would actually say arhats are able to see that. Great meditators are able to see that. We're going to be looking at what we call the valid cognition, the valid insight of someone who meditates, and that's where we would say meditators with, you could say, really calm mind are able to perceive the what we call subtle impermanence. But it's not only because things are impermanent that we say they're empty. It's because they're made up of many different things. So that's where we could say, let's say we have, my watch or a car. The classical image is we would say there's a cart. It's made out of wheels and axles. It has you could say a chassis or whatever, where you put things, and that's a cart. But what is it we label a cart? But if we take it apart, it's really just some wheels, the axles, etc. So as such, we can see there's just some parts that put together, we label it in a particular way. And as such, all phenomena function in that they are simply just causes and conditions that come together and appear in a particular way that's labeled in a particular way. So that's where we would say phenomena are empty of inherent existence. Because I impose the label cart onto this thing or watch onto this thing, when in fact it's just a set of all sorts of little parts that have come together that are then labeled in that particular way. So on one hand, in terms of its relative functioning, yes, it's impermanent, it's always changing. But intrinsically, it doesn't have an ultimate existence. It's just an appearance. Takes getting used to, but we shouldn't get used to it just as you'd say card carrying obedient Buddhists. We should have a sort of a rebel attitude, like, what? I want to get to the bottom of this. And that's where this is where in our laziness sometimes we think, well, Buddhism is a religion, I just like to believe what the lamas believe and it's good enough for me. Doesn't really work. Doesn't really work for, especially for the modern person, unless we're surrounded by, even if we were surrounded by Buddhists that all say the same. But actually, because we're not, and because actually we are living this tension of critically being critically thinking, then actually this is a great opportunity for us to say, okay, this sounds really strange. Let me get down to the bottom of this. And that's where we arrive at a much greater faith, because we're actually investigating this. So we can what sometimes I think is a good example is we think of a person that we don't know. I've said this many times, so bear with me, those who have heard me say this many times. But let's say we have a first impression of a person and we label them in a particular way, I see somebody being really kind. I think, oh, kind person. And then I find out actually this person actually has an agenda with appearing kind. And then I think, oh, what a shitty person. And then I get to know the person better. Then I know, well, he's shitty because this and that has sort of conditioned him in a particular way. And at the end, I'm less and less liable to begin to put simple labels on that person. We discover complexity. And that's the more we get into the complexity of things, the more we realize our labels, they can maybe function. And I could maybe say, well, he's a nice enough guy or whatever. But we need to understand this lack of ultimate truth around phenomena. And that we can see all we're looking at is just appearances that are a set of causes and conditions that lead us to label them in a particular way, but they have no inherent existence. See here. I'm glad you said that that's the path, because this solid is so solid. And the moment I noticed that, I'm glad you said that's the path, because this solid is so solid. And at the moment I notice it uncomfortable. I mean, what we're doing here is gradually essentially investigating our reality. And again, it's coming back to sort of seeing the rope as a rope and not as a snake. And it's not going to help that we just say, well, let me just imagine that it's the Buddhists, they like to think that the snake is a rope. Well, I'd love to subscribe to that, and that's not what the Buddha wants. The Buddha wants us to actually look and see that there is actually no snake. So yeah, so there's a process here of investigation, and we're honing in on what are the basics for really our investigation to be valid. Now, if there's any confusion here, I take full responsibility. This, of course, is just an ordinary person sitting here to the best of my ability, presenting the sublime teachings of the Buddha. And we come from our own particular culture where we've also been conditioned in particular ways. So there's all sorts of, as you could say, sets of causes and circumstances here. But again, I guess I would actually appeal to a slightly religious sentiment that is, give the Buddha the benefit of the doubt. Hear the Buddha out. Hear Jakob Leschly out, and it will be radically transformative in terms of beginning to shift the way that we think about our reality. And it particularly plays into the fact that most of us practice meditation. Most of us actually are practicing something in which we don't training ourselves in not believing every thought that arises. This is where we're beginning to have a little bit of space from the tyranny of our mind and the beliefs that, of course, the nature of the mind is that it constantly generates thoughts and so forth. It's what we call the display of the mind. But for us to be either caught in that display or not caught, that makes a difference between a Buddha and a sentient being. And most of us, we're practicing this, not getting caught by what arises in our mind. And we do so with the inspiration that we've seen sublime persons for whom this really makes all the difference. We have met sublime teachers that radiate goodness and ease. And we say, I'd like to have what she's having. So that's again where we are inspired by something that's very real. So right now it's not like we're tunneling down some sort of rabbit hole of sort of investigation into something weird and empty. It's really just you could say thinking, why do those sages breathe so easily? Why are they so relaxed? Why are they so kind? Where does that all come from? And the implication is we can see and appreciate that. We have devotion to such persons. So we can conclude, obviously there's something within us that recognizes that. That means we have it ourselves. That feels good, it's probably because it's something that is good and that it's something that touches us at a deep level. But we're experiencing this on the basis of seeing sublime persons, being inspired by the whole lineage, a whole tradition of wonderful individuals, and essentially wanting to follow their example. So that's where we'd want to hear them out and what they have to say about reality. So, okay. On that note, thank you. Grazie. Okay. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Voila, the space of phenomena.